There's a quote I read that sort of crystallizes, I think, some of this for me, which was a name we mentioned, Dr. Paul Offit, who's what would you say, infectious disease expert.
He's a vaccine specialist.
He's a vaccine
specialist.
He's who I would call if I had any vaccine
He's a giant
question.
in the vaccine world. He said, science is losing its place as a source of truth. It's becoming just another voice in the room, which to me, it's just interesting that I think missteps during the pandemic has accelerated something that's going on where there's a questioning now of science, there's a questioning of expertise. When, the government says, vaccines are safe, we have studied this, study after study after study, and there's still questions. There's still questions, and it's growing. But you are questioning these things, and I think Robert Kennedy has tapped into that. And I think it's, again, really important that we all sort of find common ground to talk about these things. And that's why I'm super, super appreciative that you've sort of opened up and kind of walked us through your story and where you were and where you are now. Otherwise, if we're not talking, I don't know how we kind of get back to sort of a similar basis of facts to discuss and debate things.
I think that's right. And Melinda, look, we could talk to you for the next 4 hours, honestly. And, I want to underscore the reason we invited you on as our first guest. And the reason being, our conversation, to me, it felt like it really illustrated a lot of the things that, quite honestly, I'm either reading about or I'm seeing in different responses and surveys, which to me can only kind of take you so far. At some point, you got to pick up the phone and actually talk to the person on the other end of that survey. I feel like a lot of your skepticism and your mistrust illustrates a wider movement in this country. And, full disclosure, you then had some of your people who are like you call me. And I've been talking to some of those folks. And, here's the truth. Like, it's clear to me that there's going to be places where, somebody like you is never going to necessarily agree with somebody like Maggie or somebody like me. We may not see things the same way. And, there is a world in which this whole conversation could actually have been quite hostile. And we could have kind of been at each other, fact-checking each other. And, well, I have this study and you have... And the truth is, with autism and vaccines, for myself, that feels to me like a study that's been the most studied study I can even think of. And, from my perspective, the fact that we're still even talking about it as a thing that might even be a cause for concern feels, and again, I'm just speaking from my experience, that it feels crazy to me that we're even talking about vaccines causing autism, because it's been the most disproved theory that in medicine. And so that's where I'm coming from. But again, I just want to underscore something that Tom said, that unless we engage with you and unless you engage with somebody like me, I don't know that there is any kind of path forward. And what I'm also hearing you say that I think is something I'm going to think about, which is the notion of health in general, being something that has to be front of mind so that when there is a pandemic, it's not just something we think about in times of crisis, but that health is actually something we think about all the time, so that even in times of crisis, we're best set up to fight those crises. I still believe vaccines are the best tool, but I also hear what you're saying, which is that, being healthy and potentially eliminating comorbidities in your life is a way of also setting yourself up to fight an infection, fight a virus. So really, I just want to thank you for joining us. I hope you got something out of this conversation too. And thank you for being our first guest ever on the Why Should I Trust You podcast.
It was, yeah, no, I appreciate it. And you're right. It could have been, there could have been a lot of, discussion back and forth. And it was, I love that we were able to all just speak about things. And I certainly respect all of your opinions. And I think that this needs to be out there. One of the things that I feel like, we talk a lot about messaging and, what you just talked about, vaccines are safe. Okay, so let's take that messaging. What if the messaging was vaccines are safe for most people, but there are still people who are injured by vaccines? Could we come up with that messaging? Because that is actually a true statement. Okay, vaccines,
Right. I think for you, it feels like the adverse events and the harms that are caused by vaccines is swept under the rug too much.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Look, what we want to do is we want to look at things that you're saying that other folks who are skeptical of mainstream science, of science in general, are saying, and figure out like which part of it can actually be improved upon and which part of it, I think that trust needs to kind of be a two-way street, that there's, trust that they've lost. But I also wonder if there's a way for you to trust them in what they're doing a little better. And I think that's what this whole show is trying to do. We're almost like a couples therapist for like the public and for science. It's like y'all are in a bad breakup right now, and we need to like get this couple talking to each other again. Is kind of the way But look, I'm gonna leave it there because we could talk all night. I just want to thank you so much, Melinda.
Thank you.
You're
I
very
wish you a
welcome.
happy new year, and I'll definitely be in touch with you. Okay.
Thank you guys. Thank you guys so much for the civil discussion. Appreciate
You
it.
bet. Thank you. All right. Well, joining us is Dr. Mark Abdelmalek. Hi, Mark.
Hey guys.
He is a friend of the pod. He's a friend of the show. And Mark and myself and Tom actually worked together years ago at ABC News. But Mark is also a skin cancer surgeon. He was voted one of the best doctors in Philadelphia.
Oh, stop.
Oh my goodness. He's the best. We wanted to bring Mark on because for our first show, we have a virologist and we also wanted a physician. And we thought it might be good just to get a physician's perspective on this. Look, I just want to start off by saying, one of the things we were chatting about as we were making the show was like, we're going to hear things that are said. And in the moment, we're going to want to like jump in and we're going to fact check somebody. And I know that was, as we were talking to Melinda, there were moments, and I'm just, speaking honestly here, where at first I felt like, oh, wait, but there's all this evidence out about vaccines and autism. And there's all this evidence that, that the COVID vaccine worked. And I kind of, wanted to just say out loud and just see what y'all felt about this. But like one of the reasons we wanted to do this was, where we're at right now feels like we're in this like, but this is how I feel, where you're wrong and here's the science. And even if that's the case, I don't know where that's gotten us, right? We're still in this place where people mistrust science and public health, right? So like it's about kind of engaging that population despite the fact that they may have facts that the scientific community has completely debunked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of the communication through COVID, and I think public health is sort of reviewing this, as far as I can tell, this kind of scolding tone, or science says, or this is the way it is. That didn't work. So there's got to be a new way to talk about these things, and there's got to be a new style of dialogue. At the same time, like they're settled science, and we're not really doing anyone a service to entertain things like, do vaccines, cause autism? So it's a balance, right? We have to have these conversations, and we've got to hear people out. The tone has to be very different, but the basic facts need to still, I think, we got to talk about this too, because we can't just let that fly out the window. And because where are we then? We're going backwards.
Yeah.
I think the way that works though is you could have science, you could have your opinions, you could have your beliefs, but I think everybody, and you hit it towards the end, like I have to trust you on some level, you have to trust me on some level. And I think the way that comes together that a lot of people can rally around is what is right for me. So like you heard from Melinda talking about her dad's colon cancer, and he was given, 2 rounds of chemo, surgery, and radiation. And was that right for him? You heard about how she went to the dermatologist and they threw all these creams at her, but was that right for her? The same thing with COVID. Like for her, she had an acute infection, didn't feel that she needed the vaccine. So what was right for her? And I think a lot of what she wanted to feel when she interacted with medicine, I think she's, it sounds like she's not really interacting that much with traditional medicine anymore, is what is right for me? And that is a question that a lot of patients can ask, but don't ask their doctor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Maggie, let me ask you about this because like that may work in peaceful times, but during a pandemic, during a crisis, is it actually, reasonable to expect what works for individual people during a pandemic? And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, so this is something I've thought about a lot in colleagues and people who've spent way more time in public health than myself. As a virologist during the pandemic, I wanted to help and was doing assays at the bench.
What's an assay?
Oh, yes.
Remember?
I was doing tests to see, basically if the the proteins that respond to SARS-CoV-2 were present or not in different samples that we were getting from the hospital at Johns Hopkins. And people were dying. And it wasn't just people with comorbidities. And I say not just because I think that is minimizing to an entire cohort of the population. But there were healthy people, like by most people's standards, 25-year-olds. I remember crying in the lab one day because I was putting together data and I realized that the scale of this and the number of people who were affected, and that messaging got really lost, that anyone can die from SARS-CoV-2, and people did. Children did. Now, people with comorbidities were at higher risk. That is absolutely true. But it kind of changed how people viewed it, especially from the public health messaging standpoint, because when we go back through history to pandemics, there has to be kind of a community-led effort to squash the outbreak and stop it from spreading. And she got at that a little bit, but if it's everyone for themselves during a pandemic, then no one is safe.
I mean, it's the difference between medicine and public health, right?
Right.
Like, I have a relationship with my doctor. I make decisions about myself. That doesn't affect you.
Mm-hmm.
It gets a little more gray when I'm making decisions about my child. But again, I'm the parent. I'm going to do what I think is right for my child. You move into the public health sector, I don't get vaccinated or I don't have my child become vaccinated, I start to affect the population. And we live in a polarized time, obviously. We can sort of limp along dysfunctionally being this polarized. But when it comes to public health, we need everybody, or at least 95% of people,
right,
rowing in the same direction. Otherwise, a virus can get a foothold and can start to do some damage. So there's sort of an interesting time where people are saying, I'm more educated now. My eyes are open now. I'm reading more. I'm making decisions for myself. I'm coming up with my own truth. But that works in a medical relationship, but not so much in public health. I think that starts to break down some of these protections that for the last 50, 60 years, 70 years, have saved millions of lives by rowing in the same direction. And I think that's what's so frightening now, that we could be upending this now.
Yeah, we're basically leaving ourselves open and vulnerable to not just new threats and new viruses, but to ones that we thought we had handled. Like measles, for all intensive purposes, we thought was going to be contained because of the vaccine rates that we have. But we see now, especially in the US, the uptick in cases and outbreaks. And that's pretty concerning as a virologist, as someone in public health. And I think it's really interesting, kind of this movement within our guest. And I wonder what you think about this as a physician, from addressing people for medicine and then switching to, I've done my own research, I'm going to pursue the treatments that I think make the most sense, whether or not they fall under any regulatory protection.
I mean, I think any of these interactions with patients is a negotiation. Patients come in, they have X complaint, and you kind of go through, these are the options, and a lot of times it doesn't matter, and you are willing to negotiate. You are willing to negotiate, but like for her, she was really pushing the natural immunity path, and that was really important for her. And I think that some of the public health experts were saying, yes, natural immunity is valid, but not without risks. And I think that's the part that she didn't really want to hear as much, right? So for her, a natural infection meant natural immunity, and I didn't the discussion could stop there. I didn't need to like put my body through things that potentially have more side effects. And when the stakes are high, that negotiation is harder as a physician, right? Sometimes somebody will come in and they'll have a cancer, and one of the things they want to do, and they'll say is, well, what if I don't treat it? And I love that question, because then I can tell them, well, this is what will happen if you don't treat it. And then the next thing is like, okay, well, what's that reaction, right? And if they're willing to like entertain that not treating it is too dangerous, then I kind of have made head in that conversation. But like if they say, I'm not going to treat it, I'm really going to start to like amp up my arguments about why they should, not treat it.
It's interesting. The vaccine itself becomes this, not, thank God we have it. It becomes this foreign substance that's really not tested. It was raced to market. And you're asking me to put that in my arm? Like, when did that shift happen?
Right.
When I picture, images in my head of smallpox with people like lining up and rolling up their sleeves. And now I would never put that in me. You want to put that in my arm? No way.
Right.
So that skepticism.
She had mentioned mRNA technology being, like she had mentioned Brett Weinstein, who we should say, has been obviously widely discredited by a lot of people in mainstream science. But she had mentioned that technology itself was, too novel and hadn't been kind of used enough in order to justify this really quick rollout, and
which isn't true.
No, exactly.
Because we didn't just get to a point where we could just like flip a switch and the mRNA vaccine appeared. I mean, it was decades of research on mRNA technology. And, in a way, I guess it was a perfect storm that it all worked out, that the technology finally worked and was put to use. But remember, one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on the mRNA technology is because it was so adaptable. So COVID was mutating, so you could quickly make a more updated and targeted vaccine. So I think it's hard for people to know that there were decades of research behind that before it was approved.
Yeah.
And I might just piggyback on that, because I think there's some really interesting things that happen in the research world that we don't really get to use in a public health setting until it's necessitated. And so there's this incredible amount of basic research that's happening behind the scenes that only gets into the zeitgeist when something like a pandemic happens, or, take CRISPR.
Right.
Everybody knows about gene editing now. And that wasn't, what they were targeting for. They were just looking at bacterial genes, and they found something that totally changed all of how we approach genetics and medicine. And for mRNA, we couldn't do the traditional flu vaccine route because it takes so much time to ramp up and to make a productive lot. And that technology is phenomenal, and it works when we're doing seasonal influenza vaccine, but not when you're trying to get something that can get rolled out within, we detect this variant and we need a vaccine within months.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the other thing that really struck me of what she said, and this is something I've heard now repeatedly from many people, is, she loves Robert F. Kennedy. And I think the influence of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on a population, to the point where she voted for Trump, the first time she's ever voted for a Republican for president, was because of Bobby Kennedy and his, views on health that really spoke to her. there are messengers in that community that are really resonating in a big way. And, I don't know who the equivalents are on the mainstream science side, like who the people are that are stirring people so much into action. And, I know that is tough because to a certain degree, I think for a lot of folks in science, it's like, well, the science speaks for itself. And I wonder if we're in an era where that can be the case anymore, where just the science speaks for itself. It doesn't need an advocate. It doesn't need someone kind of cheerleading on its behalf, because it seems like there's a lot of cheerleaders on the side of skepticism.
Yeah.
But who's cheerleading on the side of science?
That's a great question. I mean, I think he resonates because it's so empowering to take on the status quo. You feel wronged by pharmaceutical industry. You didn't get enough time with your doctor. Your food, you don't know what you're eating. And now there's this guy here who's going to just blow all of that up.
Right.
And I think on the other side of it is like scientists are like under the radar, right? They publish in the Lancet and these journals that have this great impact factor, and they wait for somebody to pick up and maybe give them the Nobel Prize. But maybe there does need to be, a stronger voice. I mean, those voices are there though. I mean, they're there, and people who promote healthy lifestyle. All over social media, there are nutritionists who are out there who talk about it, but they don't have as much, I guess, skepticism and are not in a conspiracy theory kind of way. But there are people out there, maybe just not a very strong one.
In both sides, if we're thinking about them as sides, both sides claim to have the mantle of science. One says, we follow scientific method. We think these vaccines are good and safe and effective, and that's where we are. And the other side says, hey, science tells us to poke holes and ask questions and discount all of this, all the trappings of your big study, and let's have a new study, and let's look at it again, and let's get the data out there. So both sides are sort of claiming that mantle of science. So you can imagine everyday people are sort of stuck in the middle saying like, what's the real science anymore? And now we have a complete changing of the guard who's going to be in charge of HHS and FDA and CDC. You could start to look at a case where we're entering a new pandemic, and the dissident scientists are the ones that used to be public health, and public health is now the dissident scientists. So picture the ping-ponging of messages of what you should be doing to stay safe or what you don't need to do, even though we are facing a pandemic.
Right.
And now it's a daunting task. I mean, to think about leading HHS, to think about leading the FDA, I can't, and then add in the NIH. That is so overwhelming. And this passing of the torch, like, let's see what happens, right? When, you actually now have to like put things down, and the website on the CDC's got to go live with some sort of recommendation for H5N1.
Yep.
And some sort of recommendation for name the disease, fill in the blank. We'll see what happens, because it's going to require a public health perspective. And HHS is a public health position. So he is now public health.
That's right.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And a lot of folks are actually telling us that they're very excited about the vision coming up and moving forward. But, it's tricky when, if they're going to consider them the status quo, because as we see right now, we're in this sort of anti-status quo movement in this country. And, the truth is, you're right. I think it's clear to me that there is a reason to talk about this stuff, that there's clearly, this is a fault line that I think in many ways, we haven't fully grappled with. It's been 5 years since COVID, you guys. Like, can you believe it?
Yeah.
I think we're now fully in the 5-year anniversary. I think January 20th may be the first time that a case was detected. Is that right? In the US? And it's clear to me, and I said this before, and she didn't quite do it this time. She said it on the phone, but I know it's kind of a big thing to say, but I do kind of feel like COVID radicalized a big part of this country. That it was this kind of before COVID and after COVID, where this idea of government overreach and people telling me what to put in my body and telling me to close down schools and telling me as much as we talk about people worrying about vaccine adverse events being the main source of resistance, really, if you think about even the economic fallout from COVID,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, at one point, even a year after, it was something like 20 million Americans weren't sure where they were going to get their next meal from. 12 million Americans weren't sure how they were going to pay rent. April 2020, the unemployment rate was almost 15%. Like, those are insane numbers, right? Just to remind ourselves of that. And I think it can be, sometimes we're a little too flip about moving on from this thing that, like, we gotta just kind of sit for a second and say, y'all, COVID really fucked things up, Like, I think we just have to say it. And while it was a miracle that the vaccines were rolled out, and while it was kind of amazing how many lives were saved, like, I don't know that we've fully acknowledged how much damage that did to us as a society.
I mean, in some ways we've come so far, but in some ways we're still talking about things like the 6-foot rule, which is like
absolutely.
such old concepts.
Right.
Like we've come a long way, but we're still, and especially now, if you have a lot of information out there that's, clouding the environment, it's going to be even harder to get to the truth.
Oh, we've gone
'cause you have to
backwards.
sort out.
Yeah, we've gone backwards.
Yeah,
Like, you
people
think it would be worse if there were another
Yes.
pandemic today.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
hands down, it would be
We've
worse.
gone backwards.
That's it, guys.
Sorry, I don't want people to be scared. But when I reached out to you a year ago, I was scared. Today, I'm terrified because the things that we could be putting in place, we are not. And part of it is this politicization of science. And, in many ways, RFK Jr. is considered not a status quo pick, but he is exactly a status quo pick. He's somebody that the administration appointed to an important agency. Why is CDC, HHS, any of those, why are they not people who are experts in a given field unrelated to the political affiliation that turns over? I don't have an answer for that, but I see a lot of the things that he's been putting forward that click with people, like reducing ingredients in medications, pushing for supplements or other things that are healthy living, but that we have no regulation on. And so you can't just cut out all regulation in our government systems for vaccines or antivirals or therapeutics, and then bring up this whole other class of drugs, basically, that haven't been peer reviewed, that haven't been put through the paces, that sometimes do have heavy metals in them and cause more problems than help. And there's kind of like this.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. On RFK Jr., I'll say that, like, when rubber meets the road, I think it's going to be really difficult for him to make some of the promises and the changes that he's historically talked about, as far as, like, his skepticism and his hesitation over vaccines. I mean, he's got to, like, go through Congress and things like that to really get this stuff passed. And as we saw with Mitch McConnell, there's a lot of support for vaccines amongst Republicans. I mean, amongst the Republican Party, I would say. At the end of the day, there's a part of me that is engaging in a little bit of, like, a desire to sort of see what he does with some of the stuff he's saying about chronic illness and about the food supply and about big companies. And, I think what I'm hearing, though, is that when you throw so much suspicion onto settled science, it sort of erodes at everything, it erodes at trust in everything. And then suddenly everything becomes about, why should I trust you, right? I mean, not to bring it back to our brand, but truly, we're in an era right now where if you say a fact, the first thing that goes through my mind is, who are you? Who did you vote for? What are your priors? Like, why should I trust what you're saying, right?
But I mean, like you said, that you're terrified. That's basically the opposite of what she wants. Somebody like Melinda wants to hear right now. They are tired of being told to be scared.
Yeah.
Like, stop scaring me. It's not that bad. Like, everybody's going to be fine.
And I'd say one other, like, slight, positive thing is, I think there is now, certainly on the part of, like, a Francis Collins, that there were mistakes made in the response.
Oh, yeah.
And he's admitting that is what you're saying.
It,
yeah.
While we're seeing people break away from vaccination, which seems to be terrifically frightening to public health, this one-size-fits-all response that you treat, Boise, Idaho, as you treat New York City didn't work. You're shutting down businesses didn't work. There was just no, as Colin says himself, all of the priority was placed on saving lives, and there was very little consideration, if any, of what are the psychological effects, the economic effects, the effects on kids in schools. So I think we got hit with a once in a century pandemic. We barreled our way through it one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people were hurt on a lot of different levels. A lot of mistakes were made. As we said, there were some highs, like the vaccine coming to market so quickly, but there was a lot of learning that I think went into how we as a society should respond, factoring in all these other factors. So perhaps we've learned a bit from that, so we don't repeat some of the same mistakes.
That's a really nice point, Tom.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And I just want to say, just on that note, in terms of to our audience about why they should trust us, right? I think back on, particularly Tom, you and I have worked in mainstream media, which, by the way, if there's one group that people trust the least these days, it appears to be media. I'll just say here that my time in media, it was an incredible training ground. It was an incredible it's taught me everything I know in terms of production, in terms of how to be a reporter, things like that. But for sure, I myself count myself in a group that I am having some issues with trusting media. I am having some issues with understanding how the message is being delivered right now. And not to say that journalists aren't like some of my it's that whole thing that I'm friends with so many journalists, which is true. But I guess what I'm saying is that I'm willing to take a shot at doing things differently these days, because I think our country is sort of demanding it right now. They're looking at a lot of institutions and they're saying that the way messages are delivered, the way that that an obsession with norms as opposed to sort of thinking outside the box on things, I'm willing to go all in on that. I think what's really interesting and what's the challenge with this is that with science, ultimately, there is this place where the facts are the facts. And how can you be both, wanting the status quo to be shaken up, but then also dealing with the facts, which is that medicine leads to a certain outcome, may not lead to that outcome for every individual, but for a mass population, it does. And on some level, I want scientists to think and medicine to think about saving lives. I want that to be a priority for them. But I guess what I'm saying is, in this era of trying to shake things up and do things a little bit differently, I'm hoping that this show also attempts to get at that. So
do we have an unrealistic expectation of science? And I think that is another important aspect.
Yeah.
Science is not what we know. It's what we know right now. And it could change tomorrow. And science is not perfect. I mean, look at medicine. I mean, everybody's heard the expression, medicine is not a science, it's an art. It's an art and a science. And if we are, just going in with like data points and it has to fit into that Excel sheet with a 1 or a 0 or however you guys do it with coding, we don't like that. We don't like that, and that doesn't work for me.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to
all right,
Maggie, public
figure
health.
out how to do it in a way that works for me too. And I think that's what a lot of, like, when you deal with patients, that's what they're asking for. Right? I get that the CDC said this. Now, doctor, what should I do? And a lot of people are willing to deviate from what, the recipe book called for from the CDC, because that's what makes sense for a patient. So I think if we reset some of those expectations about science, it can help. And these kinds of conversations are the way to do it.
Boom. Well, listen, that is our show for today. We want to hear from you guys. We really do, because this is our first episode and we want to build a community. We started an email address. It's called questions@whyshouldItrustyou.net. I'm hopeful that a banner just unfurled that you just saw on your screen. We want to know, did you like this? Do you have similar concerns about science and public health and medicine? Are you in science and public health and medicine? And would you be willing to share your perspective? Are there certain facts we said? Are there certain things that we said that didn't quite sit well with you? We want to hear all of this. So please send us an email, send us your thought, put it in the comments. I'm supposed to say click like and subscribe because now that's the world we're living in. Click like and subscribe. Thank you so much. Please join us again.